Relax. Thank you.
Morning, General Boyd. Thank you for joining us. Would you like to make any opening comments, sir?
Well, maybe a couple. First of all, I think a tip of the hat to ACSC in this program for selecting, with one exception, some really interesting and deserving Eagles this year. I've benefited from getting to know each one of them and go away richer than I came. Maybe it would be worthwhile to pick up where General Manor left off yesterday in his wonderful presentation, and but in that part in which I think is the absolute pinnacle of his own career as commander of the amazing Son Tay raid. Maybe I could add a little bit of texture to that by giving you something of a perspective of a guy who was at Son Tay and who unfortunately left there in July before the November raid. So I missed the bus that you sent up there for me, sir, and I'm sorry I wasn't there. But I can tell you this, and there was controversy, and General Manor mentioned it yesterday. There was controversy about the mission and the reason for doing it and the risk that it involved and the possible bad consequences that might occur. And I know for a fact that when Admiral McCain was briefed on this, and in the context of his own son being a prisoner, the idea came up or was expressed, or he had it himself, I'm not sure, but if in retaliation, then those prisoners not extracted would suffer retribution, perhaps severe. And so there are other controversies about it, but I can tell you this, that in every respect that I can think of, that raid was successful. It did not cause, it panicked, of course, the Vietnamese, and we knew something big happened in the middle of the night when the world came on fire and missiles were going off and sirens and all kinds of AAA guns and what have you. We didn't know what it was, but we knew it was big, and we knew the next day when the people, the guards and so forth, the staff of the prison in which I was located, were completely spooked. And by the end of that day, we were all loaded with blindfolds and handcuffs and whatever, and put onto trucks and moved, and found ourselves in the old Wallow prison, the old French prison, which we called affectionately the Hanoi Hilton. So, and by the end of the first day that we were there, we got a little piece of paper pushed through a rat hole into our cell, which came from an adjoining cell in which there were Vietnamese prisoners. And that little scrap of paper, coarse paper like you've never seen before, it had a little stick figure under a canopy of a parachute it had a little crudely drawn helicopter, and below that it said, Son Tay, USA, okay. So it didn't take a rocket science to figure out what that raid had been about. And of course we were disappointed. We were just, those of us who had been to Son Tay were certainly, I think everybody probably disappointed that it hadn't yielded any POWs, but we were all ebullient that it had been what we were sure a great success. And in the history of such things, I can tell you this, to my knowledge, this is the most successful commando raid that I'm aware of. Nothing that I know of was executed as brilliantly, as exquisitely in all details as this one. We've seen a very good one recently, the raid that went after bin Laden. But this was far more complex than that, much more, many more moving parts. And this man who commanded it should be remembered forever. Okay, Aim, it's your nickel.
Yes, sir. So taking you back, sir, how did you get into flying, and what has flying meant to you?
Everything. It started when I was 7, I believe. I don't know what it is. I mean, as a little kid, I could see airplanes going over, and and on the way, we would go on Sundays once in a while to my grandmother's house and down in the country road, and there was a little airport along the way, a little grass strip with a Quonset hut, and a couple of beat-up airplanes, and there was a Piper Cub that a guy used during the week as a crop duster. It had a tank in the front seat and some spray nozzles on it. And then in the weekend, we'd take that tank out and put a seat in, and he'd give rides. And so we would go by, and I would see this, and, hey, Dad, come here. And no, we were always in a hurry, you know. And eventually, he succumbed to my relentless begging and let me go for a ride. I don't know what it cost, $2 maybe or something small, but a 15-minute ride in a Piper Cub, and it changed my life. And from that day on, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to fly, and I got to do that. I won the lottery of life. But that, don't you see, led to things that, as a young fellow, I could not possibly have imagined. It opened doors for me that were simply beyond my earlier comprehension. First of all, it took me into an institution that was truly a meritocracy, and it gave you, I didn't have a college degree. I was a kid from very modest means. So I showed up for the aviation cadet program with a AWOL bag and a pair of jeans and a shirt, and that's about it. And it let me do what I wanted to do, and that just kept happening over the years. You know, there are a couple of speed bumps along the way, but for the most part, I just got to do things that I couldn't have imagined, and I got to, and then I do that, and I get to do something else, and I get to do something else, and I get to do something else, until in the end, well, here I am, flying in the Air Force, picked up the tab for all of that.
Yes, sir. Now, sir, back to Vietnam. You spent 7 years fighting in a war in a different theater than a lot of your peers. What did that teach you about leadership, about organization that you might not have learned had you progressed in a more normal way?
It's a little different form of warfare, but it is warfare. It's warfare that that has some consequences. It has some dimensions to it that don't occur in other forms of warfare. I think the main thing that happens, certainly my own view, and I think others would agree, is that you become powerless in a way that's beyond most of our imagination of how to become powerless, where you are now in the hands of an enemy that has total control over you. Whether you be tortured, whether you be brutalized in any way, whether you be fed, whether you be killed. I mean, he has total, absolute power. And the loss of that power, to find yourself, because most of us think we're pretty neat, you know, we're flying airplanes and, you know, we're full of life and full of ability to express ourselves. And suddenly, all that's gone. So learning to cope with that without having any power at all, and to still then in some way take on and ultimately defeat your enemy. And there's only one way to do that, and that is to resist what he wants you to be. To resist, and you can do this, you can do it successfully. The enemy can make you, he can break you, but he can't keep you broken. He can make you write something that you don't want to write. He can make you say something maybe that you don't want to say. But as long as you're willing to come back and take again what it is he used to break you the first point, and again and again and again, eventually he's defeated. He can't break you permanently. And that's the way, the only way I know, to restore your own dignity and your self-worth in a completely powerless situation. So that's a form of warfare that we don't find in any other aspect that I know of.
Yes, sir.
What does it tell me about leadership? I can give you examples of men who brought leadership to a level of excellence, it seems to me, that is almost unknown in the rest of my existence. Robbie Reisner, a name that almost everyone knows. Jim Stockdale. Reisner was a particularly interesting fellow, it seemed to me. First of all, a superb aviator, a guy who was gifted greatly, but a modest man, and a man that was not particularly well educated. He certainly wasn't a profound thinker. He was not going to become the President of the United States or a great scientist or anything. He was a fighter pilot, and a hell of a good one. But he also had character. He was a moral man, and he had character, and he had, most of all, he had a sense of responsibility. And when he became a prisoner in the early days, those who were already there were dispersed, and of course, and had no sense of organization. What Reisner did was to take responsibility. He was the senior ranking guy, and to take and to be able to then, through clandestine means of communication and what have you, put together a structure of an organization and rules and guidelines on behavior and so forth. And in the process of doing that, of course, he was caught often, communicating in a way and tortured, beaten, brutalized, but it never stopped him. He just kept coming back. And I can make that story last all day, but the point is that what he did, and he presented himself as a man who would behave in a way at a level of standard that was a model for all of the rest of us. And I don't know that any of us ever quite achieved his level, but he made us better men, I think, than we would otherwise have been. I put him up there, by the way, with Ernest Shackleton and Chamberlain, Larry Chamberlain, Joshua Chamberlain, who saved the Union on the second day.
Yes, sir. Gettysburg. Now, in terms of conflict, generally, you're primarily identified with Vietnam, but you also served through Grenada, Allied Force, Desert Storm. You've also made more than a dozen trips to Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan during OIF and OEF. Can you point to any similarities between successes or maybe differences which contributed to coming up short of expectations in those more recent conflicts?
Well, I didn't participate in any of those, other than I did a little bit of help in some of the planning on a couple. But I've been an observer, paying attention to the conflicts that our nation gets into. In the case of Iraq, I made 8 trips to Iraq at the invitation of commanders there, different commanders. 4 times to Afghanistan, a couple times to Pakistan, and had access to a lot that I think most observers and probably most Codels didn't have. There's a, and maybe this is just as I'm getting old and cranky, but there's a, it seems to me, a depressing frequency of getting involved in conflicts in which we don't understand the nature of the conflict that we enter, and politically, and how best to execute that conflict. I don't mean to be cruel in my assessment, but I think it is true that we don't benefit very much from a thorough knowledge of history. Particularly among the political class. Kissinger's biographer, Neil Ferguson, says in the first volume, something I can't quote exactly, but it is rare to find a public official who has any meaningful understanding of history.